We're going to be talking about the difference between a risk, issue, action, or audit finding. So these are items that are commonly interchanged or mixed up. So today I'm going to be essentially giving examples of each of them and explaining the differences between them as well. So in a startup risk register, it's common for risks, issues, general concerns to be mixed up and placed in the risk register. And over time, that leads to the risk register becoming a bit bloated or having information that isn't helpful for like informing strategy. It becomes almost like a dumping ground. So your risk register has become a security junk drawer. So similar to that cupboard in the household where you put like the spare things, the seasonal decorations, things that you don't want to deal with right now. You kind of just close it strategically all until you put that last item in, and then it causes the cupboard to like spill and you can no longer use it for what you intended it to for, i.e. storage. So in the same way, if your risk register becomes bloated or it's full of items that are not necessarily usable or practical, you just need to almost start over, empty the cupboard completely, and then sort things out, put them in shelves, put them in baskets, make it more ordered. We're going to do the same thing with the risk register basically. So startups do not begin with perfect security systems. At the time of launch, you're trying to get revenue, you're trying to build partnership, you're trying to gain clients. It might not always be top of mind to sort out cybersecurity in the same way, but a risk register is one of those key documents that if you can get right and maintain on an ongoing basis, it will do very well in terms of building a roadmap later on. So the first mistake is using the risk register as a place for everything. So let's say a client makes a request of something that they would need in order to sign, or an auditor makes an observation. It makes sense to log everything within the risk register. Let's say the CTO has concerns or things copied from like a questionnaire, so like a due diligence questionnaire that you've received or you have to complete, or things from an incident, or again, just almost being like that random place to keep things because you don't have anywhere else for it. Here are 5 categories that people normally mix up. So founders normally mix these items up. So first we have a risk, so something that could happen, and this should be primarily placed in your risk register. Next is issues, so things that have already happened. In some organizations, an audit finding would also be sat underneath an issue. So an issue is something that you're actively dealing with and you have actions associated. So the next one being actions, something someone needs to do in relation to the issue. Sometimes it can also be for the risk as well. And then audit finding, so a formal gap identified during review. So this could be an internal meeting where an auditor has come in and they've made an observation, or it can be external as well. Sorry, yeah, that's the other way around. So it could be an internal meeting where your internal team has observed something, or external to the organization. And then control gap is a missing or weak protection. So something that you've noticed is a deficiency when you do your control effectiveness exercises and you notice it's something that needs to be fixed. But again, that's not a risk, so that doesn't need to be inside the risk register. So a simple definition of a risk is something that could happen and could harm the business. So for example, unauthorized access to customer data could occur because access is not reviewed when people leave. So that's your classic JML example. It's talking about the potential for something. So note that in the example, it doesn't talk about anything that's already happened or any any impacts that have already been noted. Issue, something that's already happening. So a former contractor still has access to GitHub. That's a problem because that means, first of all, it's something that's also already been observed. And then secondly, it's something that there's an issue related to. There's a problem that could occur because that's an open vulnerability. Action, a specific task someone needs to complete. So whether that's related to a risk or related to an issue, it's almost like a one-off task that needs to be completed. But then you don't want to mix like a one-off task with risks, with issues. You want to create some sort of separation because it's easier to track outstanding actions separately to the risk register. Mind you, you can still add a reference to it, or in some tools you can link them so you can see any related actions that have been completed against it, but you still want to keep it separate. Audit finding, so a formal gap identified by a review, audit, assessment, or client process. So review found no evidence of quarterly access reviews. So it's it's kind of like a completely different thing. So it's just an observation that's been made that needs to be logged. So it's almost like the results of an audit. Control gap, a missing or weak protection. So MFA is not enforced on admin accounts. It's a weakness. It's something that you've already observed needs to be in place. So it wouldn't make sense to put it as a risk or as an issue because it hasn't happened yet. But it's something that has been observed that should have been in place. Hence why we call it a gap. So delving deeper on the why MFA not enabled is not enough. Let's give some examples. So for control gap, MFA is not enforced on admin accounts. So this is talking about what is missing on admin accounts. And then for risk, unauthorized access could occur because admin accounts are not protected with MFA. So that's highlighting what the issue, what the problem that could occur would be if it's not protected. So unauthorized access. So we're already thinking, okay, unauthorized access, we're thinking of reputational damage. We're thinking of notifying the ICO, for example, if you're based in the UK. And then issue, 3 admin accounts currently do not have MFA enabled. So that's something that's already happened. Action, enable MFA on all admin accounts by Friday. So that's given a time-bound action. And then if it was within a system, it would also note the person that is responsible for that. And an audit finding, review found no evidence that MFA is enforced for privileged users. So as we go through each example, you can see how the language is different. So some is indicating that something is not in place, whereas others are talking about what could happen as a result of it not being in place. And the main context here is that a risk, the difference between like a risk and a control gap is that a risk is that there's something that could happen, whereas a control gap is that something should be in place. So you've observed that something has deviated from expectations, as an example, or there was a plan in place and it hasn't happened. That's why that would be the key difference between a risk and a control gap. So this is like a scenario. So the client questionnaire arrives. A growing startup suddenly realizes that contractors still have access, policies are outdated, the supplier list is incomplete, and there's no evidence back. So the reaction is, you panic like, okay, let's note down everything that needs to happen. And then you list everything in the risk register. So let's say you've got like 5 or 6 entries in the risk register. After this questionnaire, you fill it up, and as a result, you have 40 rows. But if you think about it, you're still no clearer on what your outstanding risks are because you've flooded the risk register, and then you've noted short-term actions with control gaps, with you've bunched everything together, so it's not clear what to do. The fix. So if I was approaching this problem, I would start off by identifying each entry. So I would identify what is a risk, identify the issues, I'd identify the actions that need to be taken. I'd separate those out probably into separate spreadsheets, and then I'd keep risks to the side because that's going to stay in the risk register. And then I would create probably, depending on the organisation, a 30 to 90 day plan for all the other items that need to be corrected. And the reason I put it in a project rather than having it just tracked on rather than just having it tracked in like a ticket tracking system or software, is so that in meetings, for example, let's say like the senior leadership meetings, it can be brought as an item that needs to be tracked as it's been flagged as a priority. And then that means that you can have a look across the organisation at all the other items that need to be completed within 30 to 90 days, for example. Let's go with 90 days. And you can assign the priority of fixing it within that time period. And by doing that, you get to throw all the resources at it. You have a focus for the 90 days. And there's a level of satisfaction that comes with completing almost like a bundled package project level amount of items, as opposed to trying to like tick things off here and there. And more than anything, I think you're able to get momentum compared to doing things individually. And then as you're putting everything together, like I said, you've got the focus. And then also if you realize that there are massive gaps where you need to get like resourcing, whether that's people, consultants, you're able to identify that as you've put everything together as a project. Whereas if you tackle things one by one, it's not like you can't do it, but I just think it's more effective to do it that way, and I've always preferred to do it that way. So here's an example of a cleanup. So split one messy row into clean entries. So the issue is 2 former contractors still have access. So that's something that's crystallized. Control gap, no formal access review process exists. And then risk, unauthorized access could occur because user access is not reviewed. Action, remove former contractor access and complete access review. So looking at that, you can see the relationship between issue and action. You can, in a lot of softwares, or GRC tools, you can assign actions to actual issues, and then that can be a way of assigning an individual to a specific action that needs to be taken, and then closing off the issue as a result. So that serves as your evidence. And then lastly, roadmap item. Implement quarterly access reviews for critical systems. So by adding a roadmap item, you have a recurring item that you put in the calendar or in a GRC tool to remind you that there's something you need to do periodically, whether it's a control effectiveness test or a generalized internal audit. You're aware that there's a recurring action that needs to take place, compared to the risk register, that is an item that closes down after a while. What belongs? So a good risk register should hold risks, not everything related to the risk. So starting off with the risk statement, what could happen? So outlining the consequence if it goes unmanaged, and then the causal gap, why it could happen. So how did it come about? Business impact, why C-suite or why leadership should care. Owner, who is accountable. Treatment plan, what is the agreed plan for resolving this risk or for treating this risk? What should move? So important doesn't mean risk register. If it's a one-off task, you put it in the action tracker, or like I mentioned earlier, you can bundle some items together to create a project if that's more appropriate. Client questionnaire, so client assurance tracker. So if you've noted that when you have client due diligences come in, there's a recurring amount of like requests that come in. You can put it in a tracker as something we'll work on in the future. That could also be part of your security roadmap, so you know your continuous or strategic improvement. And then audit finding, that can go in the findings log. Control evidence, that will go in your evidence library. And strategic improvement or continuous improvement, depending on what you call it within your organization. So that's your security roadmap. So items you want to work on, and in that roadmap, you want to assign timescales to things. So depending what's going on or whatever business objectives you have, let's say you'd like to target a specific industry and you need to have a certain certification for that. You can decide that as part of your strategic objectives, it would make sense for you to complete X, Y, or Z by this date. So it helps you plan. Again, I put most of these things in a spreadsheet that's my preferred way of doing things, but there are tools available for this as well. And then the founder view. So what founders actually need from the register? You need to know what your top risks are right now. So you need to be able to go into the risk register and quickly understand what your top risks are, their scorings, how long they've been open, and any blockers that might be impacting them. Next, you need to see how it affects customers, revenue, operations, trust, or client deals. So depending on the nature of your organization, if you're profit, not for profit, government, that's how you decide what is your most important indicator out of all of these. Clients that are like highly regulated, for example, they're very, very big on trust or customer data, for example. What is blocked? You need to have a look at it and see, okay, where are we lacking in terms of funding or resourcing, and then that should tell you what needs funding. So how many risks are as a result of lack of funding or lack of capacity as an organization. What can be accepted temporarily? So sometimes we accept risk, but it's depending on internal risk appetite. If something needs to be accepted temporarily, are you able to accept that risk? Do you not have a choice? And then what needs a named owner? So in an ideal world, you should look at the risk register and every single item should have an owner. In the cases where there are no owners, that should be flagged immediately on like monthly reporting meetings or even outside of those channels. What needs fixing before client review? What belongs on the roadmap? So what are you intending to improve over the long term based on the risk register? The risk register should have all that information ready to help supply decision making. So watch out for these patterns. So writing vague risks like vendor risk. So like writing just like themes or things that you look at and you don't immediately understand what it relates to. So if you're to say vendor risk, that's not, in most organizations that's not enough. So you need to have detail in terms of what the risk is, who it relates to. From the title or the risk statement, you should look at it and understand what it's for. Giving every risk to the CTO, we always want to give a prioritized list. So based on risk score, based on impact, you want to be able to give a condensed list of the top things the CTO should be worried about. Treating client pressure as a strategy. Again, this is subject to opinion. So depending on the type of clients you have and how much, I guess, how much revenue they're contributing to the organization, you might be inclined to use client pressure as a strategy. But I feel like that's in opposition to being capability focused, and that's almost like the audit chasing strategy. But again, depending on what you're looking to achieve. Confusing overdue actions with high risk. Overdue and high risk is not the same. So overdue actions mean that actions haven't been completed, but that doesn't always mean that it's high risk. So you need to take a closer look at that. Accepting risk and never revisiting it. Unless it's well below appetite. So for example, super low risks, in which case, why is it on the risk register? It's never a good idea to accept a risk and never revisit it. You should be revisiting risks based on the criticality. So here's like a 30-minute cleanup exercise. Add a helper column. So again, export all your entries or make a copy into another spreadsheet, and then go down, create a helper column that says entry type, and then whether it's a risk, issue, action, audit finding, roadmap item, essentially just write what each of them are. And then the benefit of adding the helper column is that you can filter by each entry type, and then based on that, you're able to separate them out into different spreadsheets. Okay, so the final takeaway is that your startup does not need a bigger risk register. You need to have clarity, you need to have quality over quantity. The goal isn't to have an excessive amount of entries in there. You want it to be well managed and something that you use as a working document. So something you go into several times a week. You should be very, very familiar with what's in there. There should be agreement around how many people are going in and updating things, and there shouldn't be any duplication as a result of that. So if you need support in organising your risk registers or any other startup related cybersecurity support, I've left some links to the products that I have. So the security toolkit, where you have a DIY way of going through all your security operations and building out processes for that. And then the security readiness audit, where I come in and audit your organization and give you some advice on how to move towards certification. And then lastly, if you have a bespoke project and you'd like some consulting from me, feel free to book a consultation, but that's all listed in the bio. Thank you.